Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is a contextualized reading for Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Act 3. Let's jump right in. So we begin with Viola dressed as Cesario and Fess, the fool, who's playing on a pipe. Viola says, "Save thee, friend, and thy music. Dost thou live by thy tabor?" "No, sir, I live by the church." "Art thou a churchman?" "No such matter, sir. I do live by the church, for I do live at my house, and my house doth stand by the church." Always throughout the play, and I guess you could say Shakespeare in general, but there's this slippage in the meaning of words and language. That is going to be a heightened theme here. I've already mentioned it in earlier contextualized readings with the notion of the sign versus the thing signified. If a word is a sign, but a word can have many meanings, or we can have different words in different languages for the thing signified. If it's a dog, as I used as an example in English, but a chien in French, these are two different signs for the same signified thing. So this is something that as languages have become vulgarized, and that doesn't mean necessarily low, at least in the way that I'm using it, but throughout the early modern period, there's a breakaway from ancient languages such as Latin, especially official use of Latin. It takes a long time through government offices, through courts and things like that, and especially through university systems to shift away from the ancient languages. But in the meantime, what we now know as modern languages of Europe, Italy, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, English, all of these start taking on distinct forms and developing what we might call, by today's standards, national literatures or national languages, that get it, where a language gets associated with a country. It's never that clean in actual practice for people who speak or live at border regions of these places. So there are definitely dialects, if you know French, there are all sorts of different dialects depending on where, or at least accents, I would say, maybe not a full dialect. Throughout different regions of France. We know it in the United States, you can tell someone's accent where they're from. And so there's a concern with a dispersal of languages, and who can translate languages is obviously somebody who has status. So Sir Andrew Aguecheek, for example, has knightly or noble status, but he's not worldly, right? He's not able to translate French, as we'll see. So this comes back, we come back to Fest and Viola here. Fest is really trying to build his profession, his wit, on his wit, as we've said in earlier contextualized readings. And so the way you do that is you keep track of language at this very, very concentrated and heightened level. So Viola says, "So thou mayst say the king lives by a beggar, if a beggar dwell near him, or the church stands by thy tabor, if thy tabor stand by the church." And so Viola / Cesario takes Fest up in the game of language. And Fest says, "You've said, sir, to see this age, a sentence is but a cheverel glove to a good wit. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward." Again, this is that kind of notion of the sign and the signified. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that there's a nice podcast called the History of English Language podcast, and it's around episode 300. I just recently listened to it, and it was an episode on grammar and how we first start seeing grammar books about the English language in the 1580s. So this is a conversation going on in Shakespeare's time, but it's very much a fluid conversation. There's no sort of set standard of what the English language is, because it's been influxed by so many Greek and Latin words in the past few centuries. And it's also shifted away as a language from French being the dominant language. That happens with Chaucer, right? With Middle English, where we see this fixed syntax in English and a move away from inflection that we have in the language. So those of you who've studied Latin before, you will know that you learn it through cases: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, instrumental, or ablative, vocative cases in some cases, especially if you're or optative cases if you're studying Greek. And most of the learned people of the time would know that type of language, because that's what you learn in grammar school, because you're not studying English in Shakespeare's time. You're not studying English at school. You're studying Greek and Latin grammar. So the idea of what a sentence is, this is like, right at the heart of rhetoric and style. Like, what makes a sentence? Is a sentence a complete thought? Is it a subject, verb, object with a capital letter and a period or a full stop at the end? Does it have two sides of an axis of a verb here? So that the idea that it's in balance, or that there's some sort of parallelism going on in a statement. This is all stuff that rhetoricians studied at the time and still today. So if I go back to Fest's comment here, a sentence is but a cheverel glove to a good wit. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. Again, he's going to point to wit as almost like the thing signified, right? The signifier is just going to be what the sentence itself is. Here we're thinking like that a sentence, it's not just a word that's the signifier, it's the entire construction of the sentence as a signifier. Almost like an idiomatic phrase might be. Either the first one that's coming to mind here is, that's not my cup of tea. Ce n'est pas ma tasse du thé. In French, so it's early in the morning where I am. I still need my coffee. We have the same idiom in French, even though it doesn't sound the same, right? But that's not my cup of tea. Ce n'est pas ma tasse du thé. That's not my cup of tea. Apologies for my poor accent in French. So the balancing issue here of the sentence and the axis of the sentence on a verb, if we're putting the verb in the middle more and more in English, whereas in Latin and inflected language, sometimes the verb can come at the end. And there are some cases in English where you can still put the verb at the end. And poets like William Butler Yeats, all the way into the 20th century, I feel like Yeats can do it rather fluidly. But most of the time we are working in a fixed syntax of subject, verb, object in modern day English. And so there's these 2 points, with the verb being the axis in the middle. And what is being signified here and signaled is the active equivocation. I've mentioned this in earlier contextualized readings. The name equivocation is given to equivocators during Shakespeare's time. They were people who would be cryptically Catholic, or Catholic on the inside, but they know that they can't practice their Catholicism in England because it's outlawed. You have to be a member of the Protestant church. So there were all sorts of ways that when you're being questioned, if you're a Catholic, that you kind of get around the issue of disavowing your faith without necessarily lying at the same time. And that has to do with slippery language. This is just one of the reasons why the lawyers that are, or the aspiring lawyers that are going to Shakespeare plays, are fascinated with language, because, at what point do we take testimony and oath for what it is? What happens when we write things down? There's a kind of shift in culture to a document-centered culture that we have today. Like, most of us are walking around with ID cards, a driver's license, a social security number, something like that. We've shifted over to a document-centered society that's based on writing, where our identities can be stolen, right? In Shakespeare's time, this is just the beginning of that kind of shift. And so the lawyer, what words mean and what words can mean, and can language be stable? These are all concerns, not just in England, but across Europe at the time as well. All of this is to say that this looks like playful just jest, but there's a much more serious conversation at the subtext going on. Viola says, going back to what Fest said, a sentence is but a shovel glove to a good wit. The sentence is just the external thing. The wit is the core. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. Nay, that's certain, says Violus. They're in a bit of agreement here. They that dally nicely with words may quickly make them wanton. I would therefore my sister had had no name, sir. Why, man? Why, sir, Fest says, why, sir, her name's a word, and to dally with that word might make my sister wanton. But indeed, words are very rascals, since bonds disgraced them. The reason, man, says Cesario. Troth, sir, I can yield you none without words, and words are grown so false that I am loath to prove reason with them. Cesario says, I warrant thou art a merry fellow, and carest for nothing. Fest says, no, sir, I do care for something, but in my conscience, sir, I do not care for you. If that be to care for nothing, sir, it would make you invisible. Lots going on in just this little exchange here. The idea that even a person's name is just a word, it's just a sign for something signified, something that can be disgraced. He attaches it to the idea of his sister, and his sister being wanton. So as the editors say here, Fest playfully suggests a direct link between word and thing. Unchaste name, unchaste referent, his sister. Therefore, or there may be a pun also on wanton or want one. As we get down through this exchange, we see that Fest is also either consciously himself or unconsciously, and that's part of the text going on here, right? Signaling that Cesario / Viola might be nothing. Nothing, of course, is terminology for, or no thing is terminology during the period for female genitalia. And so the question is whether or not, or to what extent, Fest is guessing beyond the gender ambiguity of Cesario. At the very least, it's ironic because we, the audience, know what's going on with the disguise. What Fest knows or doesn't know is going to kind of be up to the director and the actor who's playing Fest. But the text itself is slippery and it's open to ambiguity. Viola says, art not thou the Lady Olivia's fool? No, indeed, sir, the Lady Olivia has no folly. She will keep no fool, sir, till she be married, and fools are as like husbands as pilchards are to herrings. The husband's the bigger. I am indeed not her fool, but her corrupter of words. A shift in epithet, right? A shift in what he's identifying as his vocation as he disavows being a fool, and also hints at marriage and the folly of marriage and husbands and wives. And he says, I'm not Olivia's husband. I wouldn't be that stupid. I wouldn't be that foolish. But he knows that Cesario is in this predicament where Olivia is courting. Olivia is courting Cesario, and Cesario is courting Olivia on behalf of Orsino. Viola says, I saw you at Count Orsino's. Foolery, sir, does walk about the orb like a sun. It shines everywhere. I would be sorry, sir, but the fool should be as oft with your master as oft with my mistress. I think I saw your wisdom there. Nay, says Cesario, and thou pass upon me. I'll no more with thee. Hold, there's expenses for thee. Again, this giving of payment for the fool setting us straight, or uh, showing us wit, showing us how words can be illusory, make us laugh, catch us in a corner in terms of our thinking. Jove shows up in the next sentence, and Jove, I just wanted you to just sort of notice as you read the text, Jove keeps showing up as a pagan deity, and where that shows up, it shouldn't be allowed, but because it's the time of festivity, and because part of that festivity harkens back to pagan times, that there's something about the play that allows this kind of these pagan references to be thrown in there. We'll come back to that, especially think of it with Malvolio at the end of this act. Now Jove, this is in his next commodity of a hair, send thee a beard, says Fest. And so Fest, commenting on the fact that Cesario has no beard, by my troth, Viola says, I am almost sick for one, though I would not have it grow on my chin. Is thy lady within? And then again, as they say in the edited comments, is Viola, so Viola doesn't want it to grow on her/Cesario's chin. And then the reference could be either to her own genitalia, to pubic hair, or it could be that she wants to have Orsino's beard. Fest says, would not a pair of these have bread, sir? Yes, being kept together and put to use. I will play Lord Pandarus and Phrygia, sir, to bring Cressida to this Troilus. I understand you, sir, 'tis well begged, and gives another coin. And so there's a reference here to Troilus and Cressida, which of course is another Shakespeare play as well, or story. There's, of course, it's an older story than Shakespeare himself, and so classical allusions are showing up, pagan gods are showing up here, and in the play, of course, as the editors tell us, Pandarus moves back and forth in this love story between Troilus and Cressida. And because of that kind of literary reference, that it's showing this kind of common ground, it's showing that Cesario/Viola understands the references, and therefore, because Fest has hit the mark, he's being paid for it, right? He's being reimbursed. And then after Fest leaves, Viola says, this fellow is wise enough to play the fool, and to do that well craves a kind of wit. He must observe their mood on whom he jests, the quality of persons and the time, and like the haggard, check at every feather that comes before his eye. This is a practice as full of labor as a wise man's art. For folly that he wisely shows is fit, but wise men, folly fallen, quite taint their wit. Big theme of the play: folly, madness, wit, the play of language, the slipperiness of language, and then also that kind of moment of communication where somebody understands you, but almost with a wink. Then it enters Sir Toby and Sir Andrew, and Cesario. They say, "It's save you, gentlemen, and you, sir," says Viola. Sir Andrew says, Deo vous garde, monsieur. God save you, God guard you, sir, in French. And notice how Cesario retorts right back, et vous aussi, votre serviteur. And so, and you also, your servant. And I hope, sir, that you are, and I am yours, says Sir Andrew. I hope that I hope you are my servant, and I am your servant. So this is kind of a friendly exchange that's going to go sour by the end of this act. Will you enter the house? Also, uh, I should say that there's a little bit of misunderstanding here going on as well. Uh, um, uh, about the servitor. um, so Ms. Andrew, or sorry, Sir Andrew, only has a little bit of the French there. Will you encounter the house? My niece is desirous you should enter if your trade be to her. Cesario says, I'm bound to your niece, sir. I mean, she is in the list of my voyage. Sir Toby says, taste your legs, sir. Put them in motion. My legs do better understand me, sir, than I understand what you mean by bidding me to taste my legs. So there's this language play that's going on here, but there's confusion that comes through with Toby. It's not as playful as it is with Fest. Sir Toby says, I mean to go, sir, to enter. I will answer you with gate and entrance. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm actually just going to perform the entrance here. Olivia and Maria jump in here, but we are prevented. This is still Cesario, but we are prevented, and most excellent, accomplished lady, the heavens rain odors on you. So there's this shift to that hyperbolic language I've mentioned in earlier contextualized readings here, where where Cesario, in wooing Olivia, goes beyond. And it's in that exaggerated language that it actually creates a distance between Cesario, the messenger who's messaging for Orsino, and Olivia, who's falling for Cesario, right? And then Sir Andrew here turns aside, and this is where we start getting the jealousy showing up between Sir Andrew and Cesario. That youth's a rare courtier, rain odors well. And Cesario says, my matter hath no voice, lady, but to own your own most pregnant and vouchsafed ear. Sir Andrew, again, aside, odors, pregnant, and vouchsafed, I'll get them all three already. Olivia says, let the garden door be shut and leave me to my hearing. And so there's this kind of warm reception that Olivia gives to Cesario. There's also a kind of eloquence of speech that Sir Andrew is not able to keep up with, even though he's put on airs with his French a few lines earlier. We know from earlier in the play that he doesn't understand French with the pourquoi moment earlier. And so he's trying to be something that he's not in terms of nobility, but Cesario / Viola already has it and is being received. This causes jealousy for Andrew. And so they leave, and now we get Cesario and Viola, this exchange between them. My duty, madam, says Cesario, and most humble service. What's your name? Cesario's your servant's name, fair princess. Again, the servant language, but it's a little bit overdone. My servant, sir, 'twas never merry world since lowly feigning was called a compliment. You're the servant to Count Orsino, youth, and he's yours. Now notice how they're using the YOU, the second person, but the formal instead of the familiar here. And he is yours, and his must needs be yours. Your servant's servant is your servant, madam. Now, again, harken back to the use of the French servitor, servant earlier on as well, because we've seen this whole exchange around just the idea of servitude passing through the class situations here as well. And we've shifted from just sort of simple politeness with a stranger, or the I'll be your servant, to the servant of love here, and the servant of Orsino, the person who's occupied in the role of servant at the same time, which is what Cesario is. So Olivia says, for him, I think not on him. For his thoughts would they were blanks rather than filled with me. Cesario says, Madam, I come to wet your gentle thoughts on his behalf. Olivia says, Oh, by your leave, I pray you, I bade you never speak again of him, but would you undertake another suit? I had rather hear you to solicit that than music from the spheres. Dear lady, says Cesario, give me leave, beseech you. I did send, after that last enchantment you did here, a ring. So she sent the ring, and this is exhausting, this exchange between the two of them. And then we get this, like, very kind of direct and you perhaps cruel line from Viola at line 121. Olivia has said, to one of your receiving enough is shown. A cypress, not a bosom, hides my heart. So let me hear you speak. And Cesario just says, I pity you. And Olivia just mistakes it. And that's a degree to love. That's one step. At least you have some sort of feeling for me, even if it's pity, right? So Viola says, no, not agrees, for 'tis a vulgar proof that very oft we pity enemies. And again, we're going to see this language on pity and enemies and friends. Olivia says, why then? Methinks 'tis time to smile again, O world. How apt the poor are to be proud. If one should be prey, how much better to fall before the lion than the wolf. The clock strikes. The clock upbraids me with the sense of with the waste of time. Be not afraid, good youth. I will not have you. And yet, when wit and youth is come to harvest, your wife is like to reap a proper man. There lies your way, due west. So we're in this kind of playful language of the clock strikes, and then she's like, go away, go away. Viola says, then westward ho. And there's a reference in the editor's text below that if you're in the Globe, or if you're in London, this westward ho is what people would ask when they were trying to get ferried across the banks of the Thames River after a night on the side of the bank that the Globe is on. So go back to London, even though we're in Illyria here as well. So this would be funny to the audience. Then westward ho, grace and good disposition, attend your ladyship. You'll nothing, madam, to my lord by me. Stay. So Olivia says, go, stay. She's in the pangs of love. I prithee tell me what thou thinkest of me. Viola says, that you do think you are not what you are. She's saying that Olivia is courting Cesario where she shouldn't be, and also there's a class thing going on here. Olivia says, I think so. I think the same of you. And Cesario says, then think you right. I am not what I am. Olivia says, I would you were as I would have you be. Viola says, would it be better, madam, than I am? I wish it might, for now I am your fool. Again, that reversal, right? The servant to the fool here. And there's, ways to see this as playful, and there's ways to see this as quite beautiful, this kind of ambiguity of like, how would we ever know someone, especially the person that we're in love with, right? Are we really in love with them, the person, or are we in love with our idea of what they are? A kind of almost reversal on that sign signified thing, Is it the trappings of my mind that make me just be living a fantasy of the person that I love, because they're just taking place as ideas? They're just significations or signs that exist in my mind, but they're not the actual thing. So Olivia says, I would you were as I would have you be. Olivia turns aside here and says, "Oh, what a deal of scorn looks beautiful in the contempt and anger of his lips. Our murderous guilt shows not itself more soon than love would seem to have hid." So even in being rejected, Olivia is still falling for Viola. And of course, I think I've mentioned this earlier, but just to remind us again, like this particular exchange, when we look at their words being anagrams, right, their names being anagrams for each other. Think about Viola and Olivia are both, there's an extra I, of course, in Olivia, but they're almost anagrams of each other, and then Malvolio too, but we're not going to talk about him right now. But when we think about that, how close they are in terms of their words, and we think back to what Fest had said earlier about the sister, just about her name just being a word as well, all of this is being signaled throughout here. This takes us to the end of Act 3, Scene 1. Act 3, Scene 2 opens with Sir Toby, Sir Andrew, and Fabian. Sir Andrew says, "No, Faith, I'll stay a jot longer. I'll not stay a jot longer." And so Sir Andrew is angry. He has seen Cesario be received by Olivia and feels rejected appropriately. He's actually reading the situation right, but then Sir Toby convinces him, no, that's not what's going on at all. Sir Toby wants, of course, Sir Andrew to stay and keep spending money and paying for them to party. And then Fabian, the other servant of Olivia, says, "You must needs yield your reason, Sir Andrew." Sir Andrew says, "Mary, I saw your niece do more favors to that count's serving man than she bestowed upon me. I saw it in the orchard." And so again, this is like this. He's put on airs. He's a knight. He thinks he's a sir. He thinks he should be treated better and more well received than this servant. So the reversal theme going on. As Sir Toby says, "Did she see thee the while, old boy? Tell me that. As plain as I see you now." Fabian says, "This was a great argument of love and her towards you." Sir Andrew says, "Slight, will you make an ass of me?" And Fabian says, "I will prove it legitimate, sir, upon the oaths of judgment and reason." And so they go on to tell Andrew here that, Sir Andrew anyway, that this was a show that Olivia was putting on to make him jealous and to make him step in and be brave and overtake Cesario. Andrew says, "And be anyway, it must be with valor, for a policy I hate. I had as lief be a Brownist as a politician." So there's a reference to Brownism here in this. Of course, is a reference to Robert Brown, who's the founder of Puritanism. 1581 is in the notes here as well. And at this moment, as the editors say, this moment in the text, because there does seem to be a direct critique of Puritanism in the play, that's one of these affectations that comes out through this play, a contempt for Puritanism. That comes across all of the folly and the different sort of positions of the different characters, all of the reversals. There is a kind of message that the Puritans have gone too far. And of course, like Shakespeare these are all actors on stage, and the Puritans want to get rid of them. So of course they have contempt for the Brownists and the Puritans here. Even the most idiotic character, Sir Andrew, is right about the Brownists here. And then another sort of plot device shows up here that parallels the earlier love letter, the earlier letter, the fake love letter, right? That Maria has written to trick Malvolio. Now we get another letter here being written to create a situation where Sir Andrew challenges Cesario to a duel. Now, notice just again that the role that letters are playing in here, and this is just something that's worth a more focused study than I can do here, but a focused essay or something, if you're doing a research paper, just to look at the ways that written language shows up in Twelfth Night. Like, what is the difference or the distinction between the word that is written down? What's the role that it's playing versus the word that is being spoken? And in both cases of these parallel letters, the fake letters here, we see that the written word is deceptive, right? It's easily confused. One person's hand is confused with another's. Maria can mimic and take someone else's hand. If you are into philosophy or ancient philosophy, it doesn't seem to be, I don't see any like overt references, but maybe another scholar has. But we could be thinking back to Plato and the Phaedrus, because Plato has become a popular philosopher in Renaissance England as well. But just this idea and rhetoric of like Socrates, the philosopher, has this moment where he's very concerned with writing and people taking writing, because what happens, writing for truth, because what happens is that when the person who is actually speaking is not there to be embodying, to explain the things that have been put down in writing, they can be edited, taken out of context, and then used against him, which is actually partly the way that Socrates dies, right? And so he's not necessarily wrong in that, but we could also take it into fears of new technology. So there's a lot of stuff to go on there, especially if you're into rhetoric. And so, another scheme is devised, this time by Sir Toby, to have a duel with Sir Andrew, but that keeps him here by drumming up some drama with Cesario. Then we get Maria, who breaks in, and she says, "This is going to be hilarious. Come look at Malvolio. Yon Gol Malvolio is turned heathen, a very renegado. For there is no Christian that means to be saved by believing rightly can ever believe such impossible passages of grossness. He's in yellow stockings." So Brownists were just mentioned. We know that Malvolio's being figured as a Puritan, even though maybe he is completely, maybe he isn't, maybe there's some ambiguity, but there was no ambiguity about the Brownist moment. And now Cesario, who's prim and proper, is totally making a fool of himself. You want to see the shift away from Christian language towards pagan language here, towards the language of folly. That is exactly where Malvolio is. And is he cross-gartered, says Sir Toby, most villainously, like a pendant that keeps his school in the church. I've dogged him like his murderer. He does obey every point of the letter that I dropped to betray him. He does smile his face into more lines than is in the new map with the augmentation of the Indies. Of course, maps, these are new maps, right, of the so-called New World from the European perspective, and English perspective, if you want to separate the two. You have not seen such a thing as 'tis. I can hardly forbear hurling things at him. I know my lady will strike him. If she do, he'll smile and take it for a great favor. So they run off to see this at work. And then so that takes us to the end of Act 3, Scene 2. Act 3, Scene 3, we have Sebastian and Antonio. Antonio has followed Sebastian to Illyria, and we learn here that he is definitely unwelcome. Antonio is risking himself. Sebastian welcomes him here, and he says, "Let's go see the sights." Basically, let's walk around this beautiful city. And Antonio says, "Actually, I can't be seen in public." There's a way that when I'm reading this, because there's such overt homoeroticism, especially the feelings that Antonio has for Sebastian here, I wonder about how that registers with sort of being out in public and being in private, especially for very open, more than friends relationships between men. But one could argue that things are different during that time as well. I've just grown up in a time where, even my students today can be more out more safely than people my age and older. And of course, there are places where homosexual couples still risk violence, uh, uh, being out in public. But that's definitely something that just my contemporary mind is sort of where it's going when I read this exchange. And then that's just something every reader has to sort of play with, is like, what's historically accurate. Definitely the idea of homosexuality as later writers like Judith Butler, Michel Foucault made all sorts of philosophical inquiries on the arrival of homosexuality as a full-fledged idea much later in the 19th century, that there was just enough gender ambiguity in society during the late Renaissance and early modern period that our culture, has not been, or just what I guess I'll call it Western European culture, had not become the disciplinary society that Michel Foucault, a really great theorist and historian, traces as something that happens between the early modern era and into the big institutions of the 19th century. So yeah, if you're working with queer theory, or if you're working in ideas of the history of homosexuality, and if we're taking that into more contemporary discussions around trans identities and non-binary identities, which I think are really worth considering when we look at a play like Twelfth Night. It's one of the reasons why I've been assigning this in my classes lately, is because it gives us a way to think about like what we do with criticism when you are writing papers and stuff, is we are bringing our moment into the play. So it's not necessarily wrong. It's something that we do to make sense of our own life and our own times. And that at the same time is not the same thing as just trying to be historically accurate to the period as well. So we want to be able to do both things. Like, what does it mean to have this play on stage when there's only men who are able to be actors in Shakespeare's time? In the early 2000s, there's a famous version of the play where they use only male actors, again, just to put it into that historically accurate context. But of course, it's signaling all sorts of different things when you put Twelfth Night on in the early 2000s, with the shifts in attitudes and culture around homosexuality in general, especially homosexuality in public. So lots of work to be doing with a play like this, and thinking about queer theory, about gender fluidity as well. Harder to do if you're living in a don't say gay culture. It just makes us unable to think about these things if you're going to censor something like that, and it's just outright bigotry towards people, if you ask me. Not being able to say gay, that is. So in the exchange here, Antonio alludes to not a crime where he's killed a whole bunch of people from Illyria, but he's definitely been part of a competition. Perhaps it seems like it's in trade or economics, where his town, or people from where he's from, or at least merchants from where he's from, stole a bunch of goods from Illyria, and it caused this upset. And some people have given money back and reparations, but Antonio has not. So at this moment, Antonio also gives Sebastian his purse. And he says, oh, well, Sebastian says, what is this for? And he says, oh, well, you might find a toy, you might find a trinket along your way, and you can just buy it. But it seems like there might be an ulterior motive here. If Antonio is caught, he's going to be asked to pay. He's going to be robbed of all of his money. So it might be more safe for Sebastian to keep his purse. This, of course, becomes a problem for Antonio later on in this act, if you've read through it. And so Antonio says, I'm going to go to my hotel. Again, there's references to London. In the south suburbs at the Elephant is best to lodge, says Antonio. And it's also because, this is a reference to being kind of on the outskirts of town where nobody's going to identify you as well. So then Antonio goes off to the Elephant, and we're left with Sebastian. They both exit, and we get to Act 3, Scene 4, with Olivia and Maria. Maria has an aside here. She says, I've sent after him. So she's leaving an aside. We can think of this as directly speaking to the audience as well. I've sent after him. He says he'll come. How shall I feast him? What bestow of him? For youth is bought more oft than begged or borrowed. I speak too loud. And now I see this, maybe this is what was going on in Olivia's mind with sending the ring, right? That the youth is often bought, that she's showing that he's rich, that she's rich, but also knows that there's going to, he has to come back, Cesario has to come back. And then says to Maria, where's Malvolio? He's sad and civil and suits well for servant of my fortunes. And sad here is meant to like displaying no emotion, having an air of seriousness, a calmness. Notice the word civil shows up a couple of times in this chapter. I've been just hearing people when we're talking about notions of civility, and especially in political context and civilization, civilized culture, especially as something in tension with indigenous Americans, which is another part of my research. The idea of civilization, sometimes political theory books say that trace it to French ideas from the 17th century, or perhaps a little earlier than that. But what we see is in English right here in the early 1600s, this notion of civil and civility is right in there as well. It's being used in English. It's not like the idea of civilization is just something that the French have, although it does trace back to Latin, to civitas, right, the citizen. But the idea of it being a kind of set of manners and customs, that definitely is already at work in English culture at the time. He is sad and civil and suits well for a servant with my fortunes. Where is Malvolio? He's coming, madam, but in a very strange manner. He is sure possessed, madam. And so we get this language of that not only has the kind of Puritan Malvolio entered into folly, but in that entrance into folly, he's given up his Puritan religion. He's become possessed by Satan, by the devil. Now we know in Malvolio's mind, this is not the case at all. But what they start doing is turning society on him, right? They start, the characters who have created this plot that is deceptive, create an entire society that cannot hear the insanity of Malvolio through his folly. And in a way, they're giving the Puritans a taste of their own medicine, especially when you think about witch trials and things like that. Why? What's the matter? Does he rave? Says Olivia. No, madam, he does nothing but smile. Your ladyship were best to have some guard about you if he come. For sure, the man is tainted in his wits. And then he comes in and he just makes an ass of himself. He keeps thinking that everything that Olivia says is he takes as being a double entendre for her own affection for him. Wilt thou go to bed, Malvolio? She says, like, go to bed, you need some rest. And Malvolio says, to bed, I, sweetheart, and I'll come to thee. And he's using the familiar, right? He's using the thee with his mistress. God comfort thee, says Olivia. Why dost thou smile so and kiss thy hand so soft? So kiss thy hand so oft, excuse me. Um, and Maria then jumps into, how do you, Malvolio? And so they make this whole situation like, oh, what's going on with Malvolio? He's lost his head. Um, then the cross gartering, the out of fashion, all of this stuff is just working perfectly. Maria's plan here. Another servant enters and announces that Cesario has returned, and Olivia says that she'll go to see him. And so Olivia's like really having to deal with first Sir Toby, the drunk, now Malvolio, who's apparently lost his mind. So she's trying to things are chaotic in Olivia's house. Good Maria, let this fellow be looked to. Where's my cousin Toby? Let some of my people have some special care of him. I would not have him miscarry for the half of my dowry. So she still does care for Malvolio. She thinks that he's really lost his mind. And then Malvolio, as he turns here, look at his language and see how Jove shows up. I have limed her, but it's Jove's doing, and Jove makes me thankful. And when she went away, so like here's the Puritan who's become a pagan, basically. Jove, this is all Jove's doing. And so the pagan references are throughout. And then we shift to back to that special kind of sinisterness that Puritans have for demon possession, right? So this is this goes beyond sort of the revelry of the carnival and the pagan situation to the sinister plots of Satan or the devil who has possessed Malvolio, at least the way that they're framing it, right? So they're taking jovial public play and they're making it official and turning it against Malvolio. Again, this is very much kind of like a middle finger, I would say at the time, to the over restrictions of Puritans who are gaining power, just like maybe far right forces are gaining power in contemporary society today. You can see it, and maybe it's happening over more than just a few years. And 40 years after this, about 40, there's going to be an English Revolution, right? And plays are going to be banned from the stage. So we know more historically about what's going on here. So Sir Toby says, which way is he in the name of sanctity? Of all the devils of hell be drawn in little, and Legion himself possessed him, yet I'll speak to him. And then this is, of course, that reference to the New Testament, to Mark 5:9, where Jesus casts out the foul spirits. But Satan says that his name is Legion, that there are multitudes and multitudes. There are different ways to think about this. I mean, basically, Sir Toby allegorizes Legion with a capital L as Satan himself. But this is all throughout Puritan literature, all throughout Shakespeare plays at the time, the idea of being possessed by demons themselves. Are you being possessed by demons, or are you crazy, right? So that we don't have that kind of separation between sort of psychiatric wards or something that we have today, which comes from part of disciplinary society. So this is why thinkers like Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, in these books that show something about the way our societies have shifted towards these big disciplinary structures, have taken care of problems that in the past there is no sort of separation between, like, go to a psych ward, your madness, and you are being necessarily possessed by a witch, by Legion, by Satan. And so Maria says, lo, how hollow the fiend speaks within him, the demon, right? Did I not tell you, Sir Toby, my lady prays you to have a care of him? Aha, does she so? Go to, peace, peace. We must deal gently with him. Let me alone. How do you, Malvolio? So he's putting on airs that he cares for him, and they're basically going to put him into a kind of solitary confinement under the idea that, like, well, we're just caring for you. You're out of your wits. Um, uh, uh, that's this deceptiveness that coming to full fruition. And Fabian, pregnantly mentions that, around Act 3, Scene 4, around 121, 122, Fabian makes this great line. If this were played upon a stage now, I could condemn it as an improbable fiction. Of course, we know it is being played upon a stage, and it is an improbable fiction. But at the same time, here is Malvolio being treated as having madness, and it's all of their plots are coming to be. Then we shift over to Sir Toby and Sir Andrew, who comes in with his letter that he's supposed to write this letter that is going to challenge Cesario to a duel. And the letter is just full of like nonsensical stuff. So Fabian and Sir Toby are trying to figure out that again, this is a parallel, I would say, to the earlier letter that Maria has written, and it shows that Sir Andrew obviously doesn't have the wit that Maria has. And so Sir Toby reads it and then is praising him. And then once Sir Andrew leaves, Sir Toby says, "Now I will not deliver his letter, for the behavior of the young gentleman gives him out to be of good capacity and breeding." And so we see that Toby is able to read the class registers here as well. It doesn't necessarily want bad things to come to Cesario. He says, his employment between the Lord and my niece confirms no less. Therefore, this letter, being so excellently ignorant, will breed no terror in this youth. He will find it comes from a clodpole. So he doesn't want, at the same time, he doesn't want Cesario to get this letter and be like, oh my God, this guy's such an idiot that he's beneath me to even have the duel with, right? So in order to have the duel, you have to be equals in terms of your social class and status. Yeah, so we then move over to around Act 3, Scene 4, around 191. Fabian says here, Olivia enters and Cesario as well. Here he comes with your niece, give them way and till he take leave, and presently after him. And Sir Toby says, I will meditate the while upon some horrid message for a challenge. He really wants to scare Cesario into an actual duel at this point anyway. And then this exchange, Olivia's like, I've bared my heart to you. I've said too much. And Viola / Cesario has this exchange again. I think this is a nice parallel moment with her exchange with Orsino earlier. Like, well, what happened? What if there were a woman who loved you as much as you love Olivia, but you don't? You're going to have to put them off, right? And so Cesario is doing the same thing with Viola here, or sorry, with Olivia. And then it says, Olivia says, how with mine honor may I give him that which I've given you? I've given him my heart, or I've given you my heart. How can I give it to him now? And Viola says, I will acquit you. And Olivia says, well, come again tomorrow. Fare thee well, and a fiend like thee might bear my soul to hell. So a couple of things here. I will acquit you. I will relieve you of the burden. I am leaving right now. is how Olivia takes it and says, well, come again tomorrow. She can't even hear that Viola is saying that I will pardon you for loving me and allow you to give your heart to Orsino. And then fare thee well, a fiend like thee might bear my soul to hell. She shifts to the thee, to the thou, I, thou, to the intimate form here. And the last line here, so just to note, but also that fiend, the devil, the demon language shows up as well. We've been seeing this with Malvolio, and now it's in a whole different register because of the contextual situation. Sir Toby then comes in. We get this exchange between Sir Toby and Viola, where he is saying that there's this, Sir Andrew has this problem with Cesario. Cesario is like, what? I don't know. I haven't offended anybody. You must be mistaken. And Sir Andrew or Sir Toby says, no, this is going to happen. You better be ready. And then he returns back to Sir Andrew, and he's trying to pump up Sir Andrew. He says, why, man, he's a very devil. I have not seen such a farrago. I had a pass with him, rapier, scabbard, and all, and he gives me the stuck with such a mortal motion that it is inevitable. And so the note here tells us this word, and I think those of you who are into gender theory, and it's a really interesting word. Virago comes from the Latin Vulgate for Adam in the Old Testament's word for Eve. Of man, right? Vir is wir in Latin as man, but that the editors tell us that it also became a name for very vicious women warriors. So there's a double entendre on or men who fought like women warriors, because there's a whole Vikings and stuff, and that there's a whole history of women's warriors throughout medieval Europe, and then of course back to the Greeks, to the idea of the Amazons as well. And so a fierceness, but also with the gender ambiguity there. But just what do we do maybe today in our gender fluid world with a term like farrago or wirago? Do we have any use for it? Sir Andrew ends up getting scared. I'll not meddle with him. Give him my horse instead. And so he's anything but a knight, right? Not chivalrous at all, and wants to settle things in a different way. And then Sir Toby is trying to work out a situation where they fight each other, but they maybe don't hurt each other. But they have to have the duel, right? They have to have the act of the duel to say that they had the duel. So the formality of the act and the absurdity of the act is something that Cesario is trying to understand, this kind of masculine posturing as well, and manliness. And at this point backs away and says, I'm not that kind of a man. I'm more of like the kind of priest kind of man. I'm not a fighter, as Cesario says. Sir Toby says at the end here of the scene, come, Sir Andrew, there's no remedy. The gentleman will, for his honor's sake, have one bout with you. He cannot by the duello avoid it, but he has promised me, as he is a gentleman and a soldier, he will not hurt you. Come on. So they want to create this kind of fake fight. Then we get Antonio coming in and reading the situation as if it's a real fight, reads Cesario as if Cesario is Sebastian, so mistakes Cesario for Sebastian, and jumps in to defend Sebastian / Cesario from Sir Andrew and draws a sword. And then the situation is becoming serious, of course. Put up your sword if this young gentleman have done the offense. I take the fault on me. If you offend him, I for him defy you. So Antonio makes this chivalrous, knightly kind of gesture, but it's all in this absurd situation. All of this is farcical, as I think, but there's that kind of play that between, when has the fun gone too far? A thing that I think that Twelfth Night is balancing with all the time. And I'm not going to say a whole bunch more about that scene. It's just that we get a mention of Sebastian's name, and that Cesario says he named Sebastian. I knew my brother. Am I being mistaken by somebody who knew my brother, or could it be that my brother still lives? And Sir Toby says to Sir Andrew, a very dishonest paltry boy, and more like a coward than a hare. His dishonesty appears in leaving his friend in necessity and denying him. So Cesario has left the situation, and now Sir Toby says, like, look at this. He's deserted the duel. He's not honorable at all. Fabian says, a coward, a most devout coward, religious in his cowardice. Sir Andrew says, slid all after him again and beat him. Sir Toby says, do cuff him soundly, but never draw thy sword. And I do not. So Fabian says, come, let's see the event. Sir Toby says, I dare lay any money. 'Twill be nothing yet. And so this takes us to the end of Act 3. All sorts of misidentification going on. It's funny. It's funny to the point of being sad. It's teasing to the point of maliciousness, to where people are actually going to get hurt, and then trying to balance that situation. There are parallels of letters. There are shifting or substitution of characters in different places and different positions going on throughout the play. And of course, we're at the end of Act 3. We're in the middle of everything at this point. These have been long acts. They're going to set us up for much shorter acts 4 and 5. This is a very long Shakespeare play. So my later lectures, I might be able to combine Act 4 and 5 into one video, but I will stop here for today. So thanks very much for watching, paying attention, and I hope this helps your reading. By all means, I'm not correct all the time. I make mistakes when I'm talking out loud, and so I'm not the authority here, but I hope that this helps you gain at least a way in, or something to piggyback on as you are digging deeper and deeper into these plays. Thanks, and have a great night, morning, day, wherever you are, whenever you are. Bye.